Have you ever stopped to think about how you know what you know? It seems like such a simple question, right? But it really gets to the very heart of what consciousness is. We're going to dive into that fascinating, blurry line between what we know for sure and what we just believe. Okay, let's start with something really basic. You know your name. Of course you do. But here's the twist. How do you know that you know it? It's not just about recalling a fact. There's another layer, right? A kind of self-awareness. And that little distinction is the key to understanding how our minds really work. Well, there's actually a name for this idea. It's called the KK thesis. The principle is pretty simple. To truly know something, you also have to know that you know it. And according to the research we're exploring today, this concept is the absolute foundation for understanding our own awareness. So let's dig into that foundation of awareness. This ability to reflect on our own knowledge, to think about our thinking, is a fundamental part of what makes us conscious beings. The paper we're looking at explains this with two levels of consciousness. First, you've got your basic awareness of the world, the chair you're sitting on, the light in the room. But then there's this higher level, an awareness of our own mental states. In other words, we can actually think about what we're thinking. And that is a total game changer. Now, this might all sound super philosophical and abstract, but it's actually grounded in the physical reality of our brains. So, how does this big idea connect to what's actually going on inside our heads? And this is where it gets really cool, where philosophy meets physiology. Using tools like fMRI, scientists can literally map our brain activity in real time. They can see which parts of the brain fire up when we think a conscious thought. This connects our internal subjective experience to real physical processes in the brain. So the bottom line here is that our thoughts aren't some mystical, invisible force. Cognition is a physical process happening in your brain. Our mental states correspond directly to brain states. By mapping all this activity, we're finally giving a biological backbone to these huge questions that used to belong only to philosophy. This brings us to a really critical distinction the paper makes: the difference between knowing something and believing something. Now, we use these words interchangeably all the time, but in cognitive terms, they are worlds apart. So here's the main difference. Knowing needs two things. It has to be true, and you have to have justification for it. It's what's called epistemic. It's all about facts. Believing, on the other hand, is existential. It's about choice. You can believe something with or without evidence. For example, you can't choose to know that 2 + 2 = 5, but you absolutely can choose to believe in a certain moral code. The philosopher Bertrand Russell really nailed this. He said, "The mind creates beliefs, but it cannot be responsible for its truth." I mean, how perfect is that? Our minds are basically belief factories. We can come up with a belief about literally anything, but just because our mind created it, that doesn't make it true. So if truth and justification are what separate knowledge from belief, how do we actually evaluate that justification? Well, it all comes down to the power of evidence. The paper asks this really important question: does our brain process a belief differently if it's backed by solid proof, compared to when it's not? The answer to that has some huge implications for how we understand ourselves. To figure this out, the source gives us a simple 3-step checklist. First, is there any evidence at all for the belief? Okay. Step 2, can someone else test that evidence and verify it? And finally, step 3, is the evidence so rock solid that it guarantees the belief is true? As you can see, that's a pretty high bar, and that's what separates a simple belief from actual knowledge. And this brings us right back to that key distinction. Epistemic truth, that stuff like the boiling point of water, it completely depends on evidence. But existential truth doesn't. This covers all our personal beliefs, the idea that honesty is the best policy, or our own spiritual purpose. Those kinds of truths just operate on a totally different system. This is where things get really personal. We're moving into the realm of choice and a philosophical idea called volitionism. So what is volitionism? It's simply the idea that we can actively choose our beliefs, especially when there isn't clear, verifiable evidence. It argues that we're not just passive sponges soaking up information. We actually have the agency to decide what we hold to be true for ourselves. And here's where we come full circle. Our self-awareness, that ability to know that we know, is exactly what makes this choice possible. The paper argues that our conscious self is totally aware of that moment when we step away from the solid ground of evidence and make a conscious leap of belief. And this is why it all matters.
This freedom to believe is what lets us build our lives around concepts that you can't exactly prove in a science lab. Things like religious faith, our moral compass, our sense of purpose. These are incredibly powerful forces that shape our lives, and they can exist because we have the cognitive freedom to choose them. So let's wrap this up with the key takeaways. First, the KK thesis. True knowledge includes an awareness of that knowledge. Second, that self-awareness is a real, physical process happening in our brains. This helps us separate evidence-based knowing from believing, which can be a conscious choice. And it's that choice that lets us navigate all the big, unprovable questions in life. So I'll leave you with a final thought to reflect on. After everything we've talked about, what's the most important belief you hold that you've chosen to believe, even without hard evidence? And how does knowing it's a choice change how you see it? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.